Earlier this year, obituary writers around the world paid tribute to Tom Wolfe, the American writer who passed away 3 months ago. Wolfe was best known for his work as an author, books like The Right Stuff and Bonfire of the Vanities. However, in the 1960s and 70s, he was also at the forefront of another movement, what was called New Journalism. Tom Wolfe and others pioneered a new type of reporting, borrowing some techniques from novelists and using them to write nonfiction, to in fact produce journalism. The initial reviews were not stellar, especially from reporters who saw new journalism as an affront to their profession. However, it revolutionized reporting, and its impact is felt to this day, not just in the US, but around the world, and not just in the mainstream news media, but also online. The Listening Post takes you back in time now to the 1960s with the help of two contemporary writers whose journalism was inspired by Tom Wolfe and the New Journalism movement.
I have no idea who coined the term the New Journalism, or even when it was coined. At the time, the mid-60s, one was aware only that all of a sudden there was some sort of artistic excitement in journalism, and that was a new thing in itself.
It actually started in Esquire magazine, which was the leading men's magazine of the 50s, and they were declining in circulation because they were getting competition from Playboy and these other men's magazines. So they decided that they would have flashy writing. It was commercial in its initial establishment. It was to try to write about things differently than other people had written about them, but also to write about topics that people had not written about.
The New Journalism was a style of reported nonfiction. They focused on characterization, scene building, narrative, and it was a journalism that aspired toward greater artistry than journalism had before. Tom Wolfe was working for the Herald Tribune, and he had reported a story about custom-made cars in California, and he ended up pitching the story instead to Esquire magazine.
I was sent up there to cover the hot rod and custom car show by the New York Herald Tribune. And I brought back exactly the kind of story the somnambulistic totem newspapers in America would have come up with. A totem newspaper is the kind people don't really buy to read, but just to have, physically, because they know it supports their own outlook on life. The totem story usually makes what is known as gentle fun of this, which is a way of saying, oh, don't worry, these people are nothing.
He couldn't write the piece. It was just a bunch of random paragraphs on the page, and that night he stayed up all night and wrote a letter to the editor explaining what he wanted the piece to say.
He sent in the letter. The editor, whose name was Byron Doble, just chopped off the Dear Byron and published it as is. In orthodox newspaper reporting, the voice of the reporter had to sound very authoritative.
And here is a special bulletin from the Associated Press.
Tom Wolfe sometimes called it the BBC voice, or this kind of conformist, slightly snobbish, elite person surveying the world around him or her. And at this time, a lot of the barriers around authority were breaking down. People were questioning institutions. They were playing with new cultural ideas, and this stuffy tone was no longer appropriate.
It took a subject that was very pop, that was not an elite subject, that maybe even was something that standard journalism would have made fun of or would have looked down upon, and said that it had a serious political and social meaning. This sounds so stupid now. We all do this, right? But at the time, nobody did it. It was something novelists did. And that was the way the New Journalism made journalism fresh again. One of those many times when journalism had remade itself.
And yet, in the early 1960s, a curious new notion, just hot enough to inflame the ego, had begun to intrude into the tiny confines of the feature stratosphere. This discovery, modest at first, humble in fact, deferential you might say, was that it just might be possible to write journalism that would read like a novel.
You had writers like Joan Didion, whose great project was puncturing the golden dream of California that had existed in the 1950s as this paradise in the West where you could go and have a perfect life. What she did with her writing was injected a Gothic sensibility. Underneath that perfect golden dream, you had violence, you had racism, you had a kind of fanaticism, cultishness that was brewing, and she detected that. The times were murkier. There was no longer faith in good and bad. For example, the Vietnam War was happening and officials were lying to reporters.
I think we would accelerate our progress.
There was no way to tell a story like that straight. You had to foreground your own doubts and your own self-consciousness, your own uncertainty. So a writer like Michael Herr, who wrote a book about the Vietnam War called Dispatches, would go into the field and simply describe some of the scenes he was seeing, but also the confusion that was there. And that was new, to not have to go and be like, this is where we've advanced on the front, this is the number of people that have been killed.
Old-line journalists never liked it, you know? It wasn't reliable. It was getting above its place, right, to do this. That's what a novelist did, you know? You're a novelist, you know, suffer in your garret, starve, and write your goddamn novel. But, you know, don't put it in the newspaper.
Most good journalists who hope to get inside someone else's world and stay there a while come on very softly and do not bombard their subjects with questions. If a reporter stays with a person or group long enough, they, the reporter and the subject, will develop a personal relationship of some sort, even if it is hostility. More often, it will be friendship of some sort.
Hunter S. Thompson spent months with the Hells Angels writing about them, just living with them and writing about them. And the kind of journalism that we have now that's a little bit more restricted by money, by time, by the pace at which things are published on the internet doesn't necessarily lend itself to that kind of immersion.
One of the reasons people believed in new journalism was that it convinced you that you were learning through these narrative techniques something inside other people, that you were using a writer's sensitivity to understand what other people believed and felt.
To really understand people, you have to go out into the world. You have to go away from cosmopolitan centers into smaller communities, into rural communities, into people who might not be the same class or race or, you know, nationality as you, and try to understand their motivations and their reality.
Saturation reporting, as I think of it, can be one of the most exhilarating trips, as they say, in the world. Often you feel as if you've put your whole central nervous system on red alert and turned it into a receiving set with your head panning the molten tableau like a radar dish, with you saying, "Come in, world, since you want all of it."